Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade, all serial fans. This is my review and sort of overview of the only major video release of the 31st of Republic Studios' classic 66 serials they would produce, which made them really the iconic studio most associated with serials, as they produced what are generally regarded as the best of the classic cliffhanger, chapter, adventure, and action serials in a variety of genres. Now, The Masked Marvel is, it's actually a pretty good example of the overall effect of a Republic serial in particular. This was produced in 1943, and again, being their 31st serial of 66, it's basically about the midway point of their entire run of producing adventure cliffhanger serials. And being 1943, this is of course a wartime serial dealing with saboteurs in the United States and being very much tied to dealing with wartime stories, wartime propaganda, and very much fitting what you would see in most popular fiction in any sort of adventure material, whether it be pulp magazines, comics, or films and serials at the time. So it's pretty much what you would expect from a serial. The difference here is really in the sort of character of the Masked Marvel, because there are many wartime serials dealing with secret sabotage rings, whether they are German or Japanese agents. It kind of varies, but usually it'll be one or the other, and involved with various other people who turn out to secretly be part of said sabotage ring. And then you have a lot of fights and action sequences building up to cliffhangers involving various attempts to sabotage things and facilities and companies vital to the war effort. But in The Masked Marvel, it is a Japanese sabotage ring under the lead villain of Sakima, who is actually, while it is an actor wearing makeup who is obviously not Japanese, it is very minor makeup, and he is not done to be a caricature character. And so you actually have a very crafty and intelligent villain for a serial, which makes the actual plot move much better, and you don't have to worry about any of the unfortunate racial stereotyping that would happen, particularly with wartime propaganda material or any sort of story set in this time period where you had a Japanese villain. And it makes the story more effective because the villain is intelligent and is usually several steps ahead of our heroes and everyone trying to smash the spy ring. So of course it makes the efforts of the saboteurs much more successful when you have a very crafty and intelligent villain who's not a dumb or terrible or offensive caricature. So the Masked Marvel himself is a hidden identity character, and this seems to borrow the sort of idea that was previously done in Republic's Lone Ranger serial, where you have the masked hero whose identity no one really knows, but there are several people it could be who are always around and kind of disappear here and there. So it is very much obvious that the actual hero is one of these people. And in the Masked Marvel, the sort of gag is that when trouble arises and the Masked Marvel is needed, he sends instructions via telegram or, amusingly, sometimes by an actual pre-recorded record that has to be played on a turntable or secret radio broadcasts. But he then sends his agents. So basically 4 men turn up, and it is quite obvious that the Masked Marvel is one of them, because they all are a relatively similar build and seem pretty much interchangeable, but you don't actually know which one is the Masked Marvel, although it's plainly obvious the Marvel is one of them. Of course, it's also plainly obvious that it's not the same actor who is under the mask and doing all the action. So not only is his face masked, but he has a different sort of build and stature, so it's really kind of impossible to actually guess for yourself who the hero's identity really is in terms of the 4 would-be suspects. But the other interesting thing about this serial is that the Masked Marvel is played essentially by the head stuntman and stunt arranger of the serial, Tom Steele. So that means when your hero's in the action, it doesn't have to cut away to a stuntman doing the stunt work, because he can actually just throw himself into the action because he is the lead stuntman. So that means the action does get pretty fast and furious here, and the action is what you come to this serial for, because unfortunately the plot, while the setup is kind of amusing and interesting and it's solid enough, it's not super developed either. So I think there's a strong villain in Sakima, and the idea of the masked Marvel and trying to uncover his identity keeps that side of things interesting. But outside of that, the characterization, as is typical for most serials, is rather limited, and the serial is just built around each chapter having a set piece where the sabotage ring is trying to destroy another facility or obtain plans or something, and the Marvel has to put a stop to it, and then it builds to the cliffhanger. And then next chapter we basically have more of the same. So the plot is unfortunately much more simplistic than you would hope for to then be support for 12 chapters of a full serial. And that means the action is all the more important to be effective because it's having to basically carry the bulk of the interest of the serial. And it doesn't disappoint there. And that is again furthered by the fact that the actor playing the hero, the Masked Marvel, is also the head stuntman, so he can just jump into the thick of things. He also apparently did a lot of doubling, so sometimes, apparently in certain sequences, he's actually doing the action of both the hero and the villain or henchman in the same sequence, which when you realize that, it makes it all the more impressive and rather amusing. So the action is the main draw here, and being able to see the sort of nuts and bolts of what made a Republic serial work. Now, this was directed by Spencer Gordon Benet, who is probably, I think he's the biggest serial director in terms of the person who directed the most number of serials, period. So you're going to see his name a lot if you start getting into serials. He directed for other studios. He wound up even doing the Superman serial and the second 1949 Batman and Robin serial. So if you start getting into serials, you're going to see his name pop up a lot. And he had a knack for doing really nice punch-ups and big action brawls where basically you're going to see a fight happen in a room or a particular area, and anything that is not nailed down is going to get involved in the fight. So if you love chairs getting smashed and people making flying leaps off of walls and just destroying everything in the process of having fisticuffs in a space, then you will love this serial. But because the plot is more limited, it does start to feel like more of the same as we go along in each chapter. So again, I think the phrase nuts and bolts really applies here, because this gives you, I think, a really good idea of what the appeal of a Republic serial is and what the studio had achieved by this point. It was like a well-oiled machine by this point in 1943, because they had established their practices and how to do things with all the various departments and their limited budgets. The Masked Marvel actually did have a significant budget. I think it's one of the most expensive serials Republic ever produced, which it does get to some different areas, and we do have some location photography, but it doesn't seem super expansive in terms of going all over the place and doing a lot of special super expensive sequences. So I'm still kind of curious as to why this one in particular was so much more expensive than others. The serial does build to some nice cliffhangers and of course feature absolutely breathtaking explosions and special effects work by the famous Lydecker brothers, who were basically the men in charge of all of the special effects wizardry at Republic, and they had to come up with how to do, building explosions and all of the things that these serials called for on, minuscule budgets and with the technology available at the time. And also other studios, even big name major studios, were not doing this type of work. So at this point in time, the Lydeckers were really alone in their field. I mean, there was really nobody else. And so when big major studios had to do some things like this, sometimes they would come calling. And the Lydecker brothers would wind up having to at least help out or work on other things, because the big studios just didn't have the experience in doing what the Lydeckers were doing day in, day out on Republic serials primarily. So you're going to see absolutely gorgeous model work, as you do in every serial they were involved in. And that, of course, means absolutely phenomenal model explosions. In fact, they're so good that most of the time you don't realize they're a model, and they're so effectively cut and staged that the cliffhangers are very much there's no way somebody made it out of that burning building before it just completely exploded. Another great cliffhanger is when the masked Marvel is chasing one of the henchmen, and they're in boats, and of course one of the boats is filled with explosive material, and then of course there is a ship in their path, and that's the cliffhanger that somebody's going to run smack into the ship, and there's an explosion, and another beautiful model explosion. Probably my favorite cliffhanger overall, I believe, is at the end of chapter 10, where the masked Marvel has to cut off and stop a car full of explosives that's heading for a munitions train, I believe it is. And his only option really is to just go hurtling in another car at speed to then smash into the car, and there's this gigantic, wonderful explosion. And the way that's cut and staged is perfectly executed. Not all the cliffhangers are quite up to those levels, but they're all still solid. And as with every serial, because they were made on a very quick schedule and a tight budget, even though this was a much more expensive budget, you do have to keep in mind that there you are going to see the seams a little bit in terms of the production constraints will be a bit obvious. And it's also a good idea. You should never watch a serial start to finish and watch all 12 chapters in one go, obviously. It's best to spread them out and only watch 1 to 2 chapters at a time, and spread them all out over a week or 2 weeks maybe. That way you don't forget the plot, but you can spread it out even further. You can even do the one a week as it would have been done originally in theaters, which does make it a lot better because you're not calling out inconsistencies and things. Another interesting note is that Edward Van Sloan of Dracula fame actually pops up in here for a brief bit in a chapter as a scientist, and he does pop up in a number of Republic serials. So when you watch serials, you will see various familiar faces on both sides of the camera actually pop up, whether it be Republic or Universal. So that's another part of the charm of serials. And then you also see young up-and-comers on their way up before they were famous actually starting out or working in serials. And the more serials you watch, the more you become accustomed to certain serial stars and also certain names behind the camera, like Director Benet. You've got Louise Curie as the heroine of this serial, and she's also the lead heroine of the Adventures of Captain Marvel serial as well. And then there's also the great Anthony Ward in this serial, The Masked Marvel, as the chief henchman of Sakima, and he is one of the great serial villains, usually playing the henchman, and I'd say he's one of the all-time great serial heavies. So if you watch a bunch of serials, you'll see him pop up a lot. And again, the more serials you watch, the more you start to see these familiar faces, and it's like spotting the great character actors of old Hollywood and just being happy to see their faces pop up. Well, you get that in serials as well. So all in all, I think The Masked Marvel, some people have claimed it's one of Republic's masterpiece serials, and other serial fans merely think it's okay, and then some don't think it's very good at all. So you hear a lot of different things, but as with every serial, you really just have to kind of see it for yourself and see if it gels with you, essentially, because each one sort of plays a bit differently with different members of the audience, and because you've got all these chapters to deal with, you can't really judge it in its entirety until you see it in full, and you also have to keep in mind the constraints of the serial form. So it really helps to better judge serials when you've actually seen a good number of them and you understand what each studio kind of did with theirs and the different genres and the different directors and things. And the more you see them, the more enjoyable they are, because the more you learn about them and how they were made and so on and so forth. So I think this is, again, a great way to see what a Republic chapter serial is like. I think it's very much like a sort of nuts and bolts or foundational serial because, again, the story isn't super developed, and so the focus is more on the action. And a note about the action, if you look closely at it, and part of what makes the actual punch-ups and all the sequences quite effective, is there does seem to be a bit of frame speed up in little bursts here and there. So sometimes you'll notice that the punches or the figures are moving around a little bit faster than normal, and it seems to go in and out of standard film speed. And this is something that a lot of editors like to do. It's, of course, what Peter Hunt famously loved to do and utilized frequently in the early James Bond films and the Bond film he directed, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So if Peter Hunt had a favorite serial, it would probably be this, The Mass Marvel, because there is frequently what seems like some frame speed up, maybe a little bit of frame cutting of individual frames in the fight sequences just to make them move more quickly and have a bit more energy and give more intensity to the action sequences. So if you look at those closely, you will notice there does seem to be a bit of speed up to make the action more intensive. And that's something that you don't often see in serials. I don't think it was done a whole lot, but it was just interesting to note here. And that, again, makes the action seem more impressive. So I think this is a solid serial. I don't think it's a masterpiece Republic serial because, again, I think it does get hurt by the fact that the story isn't super developed, and once you get past the opening chapter and so basically once you get past the opening 2 chapters that set up all the story and get everything into motion, the rest of the serial until the end and about actually trying to nab the villains once the plot is fully uncovered, the bulk of the serial is just kind of more of the same. There's an objective the saboteurs have, and the Mass Marvel has to step in and try and stop it. Meanwhile, the saboteur ring tries to uncover the Marvel's identity and destroy him. So it gets quite repetitive, but the action is great, and the effects work by the Lydeckers is great. So it still moves along, and it holds your interest, and it does have a good bit of atmosphere because frequently a lot of the sequences actually do take place at night. So in some ways you could sort of imagine this as sort of a Golden Age or World War II era comic that you would read that has a rather simple story, and it's about stopping saboteurs, and you have this hero character. So it kind of fits in with the time period of adventure stories like this with a masked vigilante hero. So I think it is a very great Republic serial. I just don't think it's up there with the best that I've seen so far, but it definitely deserves its great reputation and will give anyone a great idea of what a Republic serial is and the charm of Republic serials. Now we turn to what is unfortunately the only official physical media release of this serial, and part of the reason why I wanted to start doing video reviews of serials is that their preservation status and availability in actual official versions transferred from at least some decent or official source is woeful. I mean, the number of serials that are only available in crappy gray market or public domain editions or uploaded on YouTube in varying quality or lost or incomplete or it's just massive, and it's not something people think about or get into because serials are very much a forgotten art form. So unfortunately, that means trying to find the best official and complete release of a lot of serials, you have to go back to, there's a good number on Laserdisc. Only a few made it to good, solid DVD releases, and even fewer, agonizingly few, have actual cleaned up or new scans on Blu-ray. So to get any serial on Blu-ray is a massive thing from an official release. But for most serials like the Mass Marvel and the good bulk of Republic serials, you actually have to go all the way back to VHS. So this is the official Republic video release of the Mass Marvel. It carries a date of 1985, so I believe this is from 1985. And in terms of the overall design, this was actually started by the Nostalgia Merchant label, which was more of a public domain label, but they actually started releasing Republic serials. And then sometime around the mid-80s, Republic themselves started handling it, hence you have the actual Republic Studios logo on here. Now, this is a double VHS set because, of course, 12 chapters means a lot of hours that are obviously too big for a single VHS tape. Again, overall design is very much the same as all the other tapes started by the Nostalgia Merchant, and then eventually Republic would slightly update these designs in the 1990s, but keep overall the same effect. So if you manage to find all of these very difficult to obtain and rare VHS releases, you can have the bulk, if not the majority, of the Republic serial library in relatively matching video editions. We have pretty nice spine, advertising the 12 chapters, which I like that nice touch. And then the rear has a very serial image of a heroine being lured over flames, and this sort of background was on all the earlier tapes. So you will see all of these have this similar sort of background, well, pretty much the same background, but then images and a little paragraph blurb about the actual serial itself. So this tells you the basic setup of the Mass Marvel and the fact that it's 12 chapters from 1943. So at least this was getting a serial out there, but it's pretty much as straightforward and simple as it gets. We do get a nice little label on the tape itself, and then here is cassette 2. Now, unfortunately, the transfer quality, it's it is what it is. It is, they are direct print transfers of varying quality. So you're going to see things like frame tears and dirt and scratches and wobble and some cropping here and there, because it is an old video master from direct film elements that are not obviously the original negative, and serials were very much played over and over or put out in cut down versions. So these sources are going to have various stages of wear like crazy. So it's better than most, obviously terrible public domain copies, but like all Republic serials, this really needs a brand new scan from the best surviving original sources, and it's a shame that this is really your best option outside of going into a gray market or unofficial or public domain or fan-produced editions. So obviously the quality is limited, and the audio is obviously limited as well, because you're dealing with the analog linear track of VHS. Later on, they would start to add hi-fi to these releases, and the later, especially by the 90s Republic video releases, like some of these I have here, do show marked picture improvement quality and do have hi-fi sound. Republic did make a percentage of these releases available on Laserdisc with the better picture quality of LD and digital PCM sound. So for a good number of Republic serials, those are actually the best editions you can find if they didn't get a later DVD release, which again, only a few did. But unfortunately, they didn't release all of their serials on Laserdisc that they did on VHS, so most of them are stuck as VHS releases. But you can see that they did improve the quality, so if it's a later release from the early 90s as compared to a early to mid 80s tape, it's obviously going to be not as good in quality for the 80s tape as the early 90s tape. But that being said, I was pleasantly surprised that it was still very much watchable and better, thankfully, than some horrible transfers of serials I've seen, or what mostly pops up. And when you look up the Mass Marvel, or you look at various YouTube uploads or different things, most of the time it's actually just going to be a copy somebody made of the VHS tape release. And for a lot of serials that don't have modern restored releases and only have a VHS or Laserdisc, most times you see it uploaded or sold as a public domain or bootleg DVD or something, or a weird copy you see on eBay somebody selling. Usually it's just duped off of somebody just recording their VCR output or trying to record the Laserdisc. So by going and tracking down the actual best official physical releases, you're usually going to the source of whatever the various not so good uploads are. So at least you don't have to worry about any quality loss from the already limited quality of the original release, because you're going to the real thing and you're not looking at some copy or upload. It is unfortunately difficult to track all of these down. It's difficult to even figure out what was released where and what has an official release and what made it to DVD, what exists on Blu-ray, because the Republic Library has kind of been split up by on different labels over the years. And again, they did a bulk of serial releases during the standard def era. Most of them got VHS, some got Laserdisc, and then some actually got DVD releases. So you do have to do a lot of research and try to figure this stuff out. And unfortunately, the VHS tapes and Laserdiscs are not common. So anytime I can get a hold of one, I get super excited, and then I can dive into another serial. So unfortunately, the quality is rather limited on the VHS release of the Mass Marvel. Do expect some damage inherent to the source and a little bit of aliasing here and there, along with some hum in the audio at certain points, which also ties into the audio of the serial actually having some inherent wear and damage, of course. So it is what it is, but unfortunately, in terms of official physical media releases from a studio and an official source, this is all there is. So if you're curious about this serial, there are many different versions uploaded online. Unfortunately, the status of serials, some fell into the public domain, some the status is kind of questionable. Some it seems that Republic, which is now owned under Paramount in terms of who owns the Republic name and license, some are still under copyright, but it's not enforced. It's a weird sort of gray area that, again, is a sign of, unfortunately, most people not really knowing anything about or caring about serials at all. So if you look at versions online that are of limited quality, 9 times out of 10, it's just going to be somehow a copy of the only physical release from the past. And so obviously it's going to be just copies of this VHS tape. So if you're curious about it, I do highly recommend this serial. If you're curious about learning more about Republic serials or what a cliffhanger serial is like, this is a good way to get a sort of taste of the Republic style. And it's a good serial with great action. It's just not necessarily one I would advise people to try as their first serial. It's a very good to excellent Republic serial for the style and the action, but it's not up there with the legendary Republic serials, I think, because unfortunately I think the story kind of holds it back some by being just a bit too simplistic, and the bulk of the serial kind of being more of the same throughout. So those are my thoughts on the unfortunately only decent official release of The Masked Marvel, the 31st Republic serial on the 1985 Republic Pictures dual VHS tape release, which, again, is unfortunately the only official physical media release of one of Republic's best regarded serials. And that's, again, why I'm doing these videos as I go along, because I want to at least get people at least more aware of film serials, and hopefully encourage people to finally try out the amazing qualities of the Republic Chapter serial, but also make people more aware of the horrible preservation status of the vast majority of all film serials. And with Republic being the most legendary of serial producing studios, obviously their library is the most important and the most iconic. So it's a great example of just how, even if Republic serials aren't properly preserved, then how is it going to go for all the other studios that are nowhere near as famous? And at least Universal is now making new scans of some of the Universal serials, and those are being put out mostly by VCI, who have done some Republic serials, and unfortunately the transfers and things are usually not good at all. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on serials, and unfortunately, because it's sort of a unknown art form to people today, it doesn't have that recognition factor. And I think if it was better known of what serials were and what they meant and how important they are to pop culture at large, I think people would be more willing to put some elbow grease in and actually work on properly preserving serials. So that's really the sort of impetus for doing these videos, and I've always wanted to learn more and see more serials. So now I just jump at the chance anytime I get to look at a proper official release. So that means, of course, I usually wait until I can find one of these to actually watch a serial for the first time. So I'm having to wait until I can find various VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, and Blu-ray editions, and in some rare instances, to then actually sit down and properly watch a serial, because I don't want to watch some terrible version floating around. But unfortunately, for a lot of serials, that's really the only option. So once I exhaust these, that's what I'm going to have to start doing, is looking at the myriad of releases of serials. So again, this whole sort of, I guess this is technically a new video review series that I'll do sporadically when I get to look at one of these editions, but the real reason is to not only talk about the importance of serials, review some serials, but also talk about the real importance for there needing to be a focus on the preservation of serials, because their preservation status is unfortunately in the toilet. So those are my thoughts on the Masked Marvel and the sort of status of Republic serials and their preservation status, which is unfortunately very dire, and unfortunately means that for most of the most iconic serials from the most iconic serial studio, you have to go all the way back to VHS to have an official physical release from the actual studio entity, and that's really ridiculous in 2023. That you should have to go back to VHS for something this iconic and this important to not just adventure films, but really action in the cinema in general, because without the adventure serial, and specifically the Republic serial, I mean, action cinema really wouldn't exist. And the action here in Republic serials, regardless of which you may prefer, and some obviously being of lesser quality than others, the action is the mainstay and was revolutionary for film in general, because without the adventure serial, it's quite likely the action sequence would still be in its infancy. And it was the action adventure serial, specifically the Republic serial, that advanced the action scene to what we think of today. So that means these still remain some of not just the most important, but still some of the greatest action films ever made, and a perfect example, and really the lightning rod that moved forward the action sequence from its infancy to what we recognize as an action sequence today. And you also get the benefit of everything is done for real, because these were produced under limited constraints and predated the digital technology that is overused today. So, outside of some effect shots and some opticals and some model work, everything you see is done for real by real guys. So when you have an entire room get smashed up by, 10 guys having a fist fight, and it turns into a complete brawl, it's real, and there's no cutaways, and that gives you a particular charge that keeps you coming back to serials, because everything is blood, sweat, and tears, and everybody putting 200% in. So that's another reason why serials remain timeless. So as always, I hope you have enjoyed my babblings about film culture, the motion picture serial, the magic of Republic serials, physical media, and hopefully the greater preservation of film serials, which unfortunately has never been top on anyone's list for film preservation. So please do check out the Masked Marvel if you're interested, or Republic serials in general, and do try to find some better official releases, or at least for serials like this, if you don't have access to these because they're rather hard to track down, do try to find a better version that somebody's uploaded or put up somewhere, obviously dubbed from the same VHS source. So as always, please do keep supporting your independent stores by purchasing physical media releases and trying to hopefully find other hard to find releases of serials, because every once in a while they pop up. Please support any modern releases of serials that you can, such as some of the Republic serials that Paramount did do scans of and Kino Lorber put out. Some were put out by Olive Films, and now VCI is doing some Blu-rays of new Universal scans of Universal serials. So anytime that there's a new serial release, do try to support that, to show that there is support for preserving this art form, and there are those of us out here who actually enjoy watching and studying classic adventure serials. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.